Apple has made significant improvements to their storage options in recent years. The iPad lineup now starts at 128 gigabytes across the board. USB-C is standard now. The storage squeeze that frustrated users for years has finally ended. But here's what most people don't realize. For over a decade, Apple executed one of the most sophisticated pricing strategies in consumer technology history. In 2019 alone, analysts estimated that Apple generated $18 billion in revenue just from storage upgrades across their product lines. That represented roughly a quarter of Apple's total operating profit that year from a single component. Industry analysis called it the NAND gravity train. Customers felt it every time they configured a device. Competitors eventually copied it. I call it the Apple ladder. Today, I'm going to show you exactly how it worked, why it was so effective, and what we can learn from perhaps the most elegant upselling mechanism ever designed. To understand the Apple ladder, we need to go back to where it all began. And trust me, the history here matters because it reveals just how deliberate this strategy was. For over a decade, Apple maintained a consistent pattern. Start with constrained base storage, charge premium prices to upgrade, and offer no alternatives like expandable memory. The frustration was real and it was everywhere. Let's rewind to 2013. Apple released the iPhone 5S with just 16 gigabytes of storage, which now sounds crazy, right? But on paper, this seemed reasonable for the time. But in practice, it was borderline unusable. Here's why. iOS itself consumed several gigabytes right out of the box. By the time you unboxed a 16 gigabyte iPhone 5S, you had maybe 12 to 13 gigabytes of actual usable space. Now add your essential apps like Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, maybe even a few games. That's another couple gigabytes gone. Take some photos and videos at a family gathering or vacation, a few hundred megabytes to a gigabyte, depending on how much you shoot. Download some music for offline listening, maybe a gigabyte or two if you wanted a decent playlist. Suddenly, you're staring at a storage warning within weeks of owning the device. And the experience of managing a full iPhone storage was miserable. You'd constantly get notifications that you couldn't take photos because storage was full. You'd have to delete apps to update other apps. You would offload messages and photos hoping you wouldn't need them later. It was a constant battle. Meanwhile, Samsung's approach was completely different. The Galaxy S4 that same year also started with 16 gigabytes of internal storage. But Samsung included a micro SD card slot. Users could walk into any electronics store, spend $20 to $30 on a 32 or 64 gigabyte micro SD card, pop it in, and instantly solve the storage problem. No configuration changes, no paying premium prices to Samsung. Just a simple, cheap expansion option. Apple offered nothing like this. If you needed more storage on an iPhone, your only option was to have bought a more expensive model up front. The 32 gigabyte iPhone 5S cost $100 more. The 64 gigabyte model cost $200 more. And you couldn't change your mind after purchase. No expansion, no upgrade. You were locked in. This was only the beginning of the pattern. Fast forward to 2016, Apple finally bumped the base iPhone 7 to 32 gigabytes. This was progress, sure, but by 2016, the demands on storage had grown extensively. The iPhone 7 introduced 4K video recording at 30 frames per second. 1 minute of 4K video consumed roughly 375 megabytes of storage. A 5-minute video, nearly 2 gigabytes. Apps had also grown substantially. In 2013, the average app size was around 23 megabytes. By 2016, that had grown to over 35 megabytes, with popular apps like Facebook and games pushing well over 100 megabytes. High-resolution photos from the improved 12 megapixel camera were taking up 3 to 5 megabytes each, and cloud storage, while available through through iCloud wasn't yet mature or reliable enough for most users. The free iCloud tier was just 5 gigabytes, barely enough for device backups. Paying for more iCloud storage was another recurring cost users had to consider. So that 32 gigabyte base iPhone 7, it still filled up fast. Samsung's Galaxy S7 from the same year not only started at 32 gigabytes, but again included expandable storage up to 200 gigabytes via micro SD. The contrast was stark and deliberate. Even LG's phones had expandable storage. Many mid-range Android devices had expandable storage too. Even budget phones often included it. But Apple, nothing. You paid Apple's price or you dealt with the limitations. The pattern continued through 2017. The iPhone 8 came in 64 and 256 gigabyte configurations. Notice the jump there, 64 to 256. No middle option. That wasn't accidental. By eliminating a middle tier, Apple made the decision harder. Either stick with 64 gigabytes and risk running out of space, or pay significantly more for 256 gigabytes, which was probably more than most users needed. This pricing structure pushed users towards extremes rather than offering comfortable middle ground. And 64 gigabytes in 2017, while better than previous years, still felt limiting. Consider the user who wanted to keep their photos and videos on device, download music for offline listening, install some games, and have a few productivity apps. I mean, come on, you would hit 64 gigabytes faster than you'd think. The complaints during this era were everywhere. Every single major iPhone review from tech publications like The Verge, CNET, and more mentioned storage limitations as a significant drawback. Reddit's Apple communities had weekly threads about storage management tips and frustration. YouTube creators built entire videos around the economics of Apple's storage pricing, and the economics were damning. Industry teardowns and component cost analysis revealed something striking. The actual cost to Apple for NAND flash memory was only a fraction of what they charged customers. In 2018, analysts calculated that the component cost difference between a 64 gigabyte iPhone and a 256 gigabyte iPhone was roughly $50 to $70. Apple charged customers $150 to $200 for that upgrade. By 2018, with the iPhone, the jump from 64 gigabytes to 512 gigabytes added approximately $132 in component costs to Apple's manufacturing. Apple charged customers $350 more for that top tier model. That's a $218 profit margin on a single component. Estimates put the profit margin on storage upgrades at 75 to 90%. Compare that to the overall profit margin on an iPhone, which typically ranged from 35 to 40%. Storage upgrades were just crazy profitable, and it wasn't just iPhones. iPads followed the same pattern. Entry models with 32 or 64 gigabytes. MacBooks with 128 or 256 gigabyte base configurations, when professionals routinely needed 512 gigabytes or more. Across every product line, the pattern held. Constrained base storage, expensive upgrades, and no alternatives. To outside observers, this looked like Apple being cheap or greedy, but that analysis missed the bigger picture. This wasn't about saving money on components. Apple was already pricing their products at premium levels. Adding another $50 in storage costs wouldn't have hurt their margins significantly. No, this was about something more sophisticated. Apple was building a ladder. What Apple engineered was a systematic value capture mechanism through tiered product architecture. The Apple ladder worked through three key principles. First, establish an attractive entry price with intentionally constrained specifications. Second, price upgrades strategically so they bridge you to the next product tier. Third, repeat the constraint at each level so the product continues upward. Let's see this in action from the iPad lineup from 2021 through 2023. The entry iPad sat at $329 with just 64 gigabytes and a Lightning connector. This got most customers in the door. For casual users, this device was perfectly adequate for web browsing, streaming, and basic apps. But the product architecture ensured that any deviation from baseline specs triggered margin expansion opportunities. opportunities. Here's how the ladder worked. You started shopping at that $329 base model. Then you noticed it used Lightning instead of USB-C. Maybe you wanted the convenience of using the same cable as your other devices. Moving to USB-C required stepping up to the 10th generation iPad at $449. First step climbed. However, that unit also shipped with only 64 gigabytes. For anyone downloading apps, storing documents, or keeping movies for travel, 64 gigabytes created immediate friction. Bumping from 64 to 256 gigabytes cost $150 more, bringing you to a total of $599. Second step climbed. But at $599, the iPad Air was available. The Air offered a superior display, more powerful processor, and sleeker design. Of course you would consider it, because why not get the Air for the same price? Third step climbed, except the iPad Air also started at 64 gigabytes. The latter reset. If you wanted adequate storage on the Air, you needed another $150 to upgrade to 256 gigabytes, bringing you to a total of $749. Fourth step climb. Think about the journey. You entered thinking about a $329 iPad. Through completely logical, incremental decisions, you found yourself spending $749, more than double your initial budget. And at no point did you feel manipulated. Each choice made sense in isolation. Better connectivity, adequate storage, superior hardware. The MacBook lineup followed identical logic. The MacBook Air started at $999 with 256 gigabytes. For light users, fine. But anyone doing photo editing, video work, or software development would bump against that limit quickly. Upgrading to 512 gigabytes cost $200 more. At $1,199, you're suddenly within reach of configurations with more RAM, or considering whether the MacBook Pro makes more sense. Same ladder, same mechanism. What made this so effective was the structure. Apple wasn't forcing anything on you, but those choices were made to naturally guide customers upward. The storage constraint created genuine friction that users wanted to resolve. The storage upgrade brought them to a price where better hardware became accessible. The better hardware reintroduced the storage question, a self-reinforcing loop. Apple didn't need aggressive sales tactics or pushy employees. The product architecture did the work. Customers convinced themselves to spend more because each upgrade genuinely provided value. This was margin optimization through product design. In 2019, analysts estimated this strategy generated $18 billion in revenue. That represented about 26% of Apple's entire operating profit that year. One component, one elegantly designed pricing structure, billions in profit. The Apple ladder succeeded because it understood fundamental consumer psychology. First, incremental decisions are easier than large ones. Asking someone to spend $1,200 on a device feels like a big ask, but asking them to spend $100 more for double the storage, easy. Then another $100 for a better model, sure. Each step was small. The effect was massive. Second, people anchor to their initial consideration. Once you've mentally committed to spending $600, the barrier to spending $750 is much lower. Apple's pricing tiers kept you climbing within zones you had already accepted. Third, every upgrade provided genuine value. This wasn't a scam. 256 gigabytes is meaningfully better than 64 for many users. A more powerful processor improves the experience. Apple wasn't tricking anyone. The brilliance was in that pricing structure that made each tier accessible from the one below it. This is why customers didn't feel manipulated. They felt smart. They felt like they were making informed decisions. And in many cases, they were. The latter just ensured the best product for their needs was usually more expensive than they initially considered. Competitors noticed. Samsung removed the micro SD slot from the Galaxy S21 in 2021. Why? Because they saw how profitable Apple's tiered storage approach was. The Apple ladder became the industry standard. So what changed? Why did Apple finally increase base storage on iPads? The answer is pragmatism. When the storage squeeze becomes too obvious, when it generates genuine backlash that affects sales, Apple adjusts. The iPad market was particularly price sensitive. The 64GB base with Lightning felt outdated even by Apple standards, so they evolved. All iPads now start at 128GB with USB-C. The latter still exists. It's just less aggressive. And that might be the most important lesson here. The Apple ladder generated tens of billions in profit over a decade, but Apple knew when to adjust before it came too criticized, too much of a liability. The real genius wasn't just the ladder's design, it was knowing when to evolve. So the next time you're configuring an Apple product, remember the ladder. Understand those pricing tiers. They're carefully calculated to guide you upward, and then decide whether each step genuinely adds value for your use case. Because for over a decade, Apple proved that the most sophisticated sales technique isn't a sales technique at all. It's product architecture. It's making customers want to climb a ladder you've carefully designed for them, and generating billions of dollars along the way. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing, and I'll see you in the next video.